Hello. In 1897, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society produced this book, Millennial Dawn, Volume 4. Its original title was The Day of Vengeance, C.T. Russell's fourth volume of the collection that later became known as Studies in the Scriptures. When the cover changed from gray to red, it changed its title. Here you see the new title for subsequent sets of Russell's works, The Battle of Armageddon. The thesis of both of the editions of it was that in 1914 would commence the war of the great day of God Almighty, Armageddon, the day of vengeance. And of course, when World War I hit, at first at least, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and Russell and the followers of Russell claimed that an extraordinary prophecy was being fulfilled. But of course, as time went by and the World War I developed over the space of the years 1914 to 1916, disappointment set in, because 1914 was not supposed to be the beginning of the end for God's people on earth. It was to be the end of the end. The end had begun in 1799, according to Russell's calculations in these 6 volumes he wrote of Studies in the Scriptures, and it was to end in 1914 with the taking away of the saints to glory. So by the time of 1916, when Russell died, this disappointment had become chronic among his adherents, who were already being called by onlookers Russellites, because they seemed to think, with good reason, that C.T. Russell was fulfilling the role for the Watchtower that had been predicted by Jesus Christ himself. He was, according to this way of looking at Jesus' prediction, which is really not a prediction but a parable, when he said, "Who is really the faithful and discreet slave?" Jesus posed it as a question. It was actually no more than a question. It was not an explicit prediction. But when Russell died, the adherents of Russell thought that the faithful and discreet slave had died. So by this time it was unanimous among Bible students, as they were also called, that C.T. Russell fulfilled the role of faithful and discreet slave, or faithful and wise servant, as he tended to be called more often, because the people who were reading his books and giving him authority, absolute authority it almost appeared, were reading at that time the King James Bible for the most part. While we're on the subject of the King James Bible and the subsequent Watchtower version of the Bible, also called in 1950, when it started to come out, the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures, that version was based upon the work of 2 Greek scholars, Westcott and Hort, Brooke Foss Westcott and Fenton Hort. The average Jehovah's Witness doesn't know who these 2 men are. They were both Anglicans. They were both great scholars who had the ear of the rest of the world, and their version of the Greek New Testament was actually behind the revised version of the 1880s, just before Russell started his publication of books. The revised version by Westcott and Hort became the basis of the New World Translation, and still is. Fenton Hort, therefore, will be a familiar name to most Jehovah's Witnesses, even if they don't know that he was an Anglican scholar and that he was one of the Cambridge Triumvirate, along with his good friends, J.B. Lightfoot and Brooke Foss Westcott, both of whom, by the way, became Anglican bishops. Fort was the only one of the 3 that didn't become an Anglican bishop, but it's thought that he was the chief source of the scholarship that went into the Westcott and Hort text. He did perhaps about 2/3 of the work on it. We can't be sure. But he was a great Greek scholar, and in the same year that Russell had published this, The Day of Vengeance, Fenton Hort had published this. Actually, it was published posthumously 5 years after his death. He died in 1892. Fenton Hort wrote a book which is probably his most famous book other than his work on the Greek text, the Christian Ecclesia, which of course is the Greek word for church. And interestingly, in 1897, Fenton Hort had taken on the interpretation of the chapter that has become the most important chapter in the world, really, after who really is the faithful and discreet slave. The text, of course, taken from Matthew 24. Probably the most important text for Jehovah's Witnesses is Acts 15, where they find their doctrine of the governing body. Now, in Russell's day, and even Rutherford's, there was no concept of a governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. There was the concept of the faithful and discreet slave, which in Russell's day, and even for 10 years after Russell's day, into the 1920s, Rutherford and the other leaders of the Watchtower still continued to teach that actually the faithful and wise servant, or discreet slave as later translated, was actually Russell himself. Then they changed the teaching, and now the faithful and wise servant was associated with the 144,000 members of the heavenly class corporately. That teaching is still with the Watchtower today. But now we've changed again to the point where the governing body is no longer made up of just members of the faithful and discreet slave class, so-called. No longer made up of anointed Christians, necessarily. But in those days, this conceit that the governing body of God's people on earth was somehow associated with this faithful and discreet slave class, and that this was also foreshadowed, by the way, in book of Acts chapter 15, in the Jerusalem Council. It is thought, therefore, there's some continuity here, that in the first century there was a governing body, and therefore by logic and theologic, in the 21st century and the 20th and the 19th, before that, there was a governing body of leaders found, of course, exclusively within the Watchtower camp. Fenton Hort, though, in his book The Christian Ecclesia, had said in 1897 about that Jerusalem conference that the Church of Antioch, he called it the Ecclesia of Antioch, had acted independently and apparently without difference of opinion from the Jerusalem church. Notice he goes from that thought to soon a troubling of the peace came from without, from Judea. So the way he viewed the relationship of the two churches, Jerusalem and Antioch, in Acts chapter 15, is actually the opposite of the way the Watchtower came to view those two churches. It's worth noticing, he says, that we hear nothing of complaints against the Ecclesia of Antioch as having exceeded its legitimate powers. It is very interesting that Fred Franz himself in the 1970s, after the governing body idea was accepted by the Watchtower, gave a talk which is today required listening for those leaving the organization, because in that talk Fred Franz admitted the truth that was in Fenton Hort in 1897, namely that the Antioch church was acting independently of Jerusalem. In fact, all the churches after Paul's 3 missionary journeys were operating relatively independently of Jerusalem. Pause for a second.
Well, I don't pause.
Okay. A page later, Hort is talking about this independence of the Antioch church. He goes on, the independence of the Ecclesia of Antioch had to be respected, and yet in not such a way as to encourage disregard either of the great mother Ecclesia, i.e. Jerusalem, or of the Lord's own apostles, or of the unity of the whole Christian body. Accordingly, we do not find a word of a hint that the Antiochians would have done better to get sanction from Jerusalem before plunging into such grave responsibilities. But along with the cordial concurrence in the release of Gentile converts from legal requirements, there goes a strong expression of opinion, more than advice and less than a command, respecting certain salutary restraints. A certain authority is thus implicitly claimed, There is no evidence that it was more than moral authority. So Hort's position on the Jerusalem Council is that although it did have a mother church authority, which was in effect moral authority, it was not an absolute authority over other churches or congregations that already existed. Now, Hort carries on about the prohibitions that were included as part of the decision of the Jerusalem Council. That is, the 4 restrictions, including, of course, the blood restriction that is still a requirement for Jehovah's Witnesses by the Watchtower Authority today. And Hort says about those restrictions, the great liberative measure to which the apostles joined with the elders and ecclesia of Jerusalem in setting their hands stood fast and determined the character of by far the greater part of the new ecclesia, while these petty adjuncts to it, that's his phrase, the petty adjuncts, these 4 legal requirements having to do with sex, blood, and idolatry. Having served their purpose, these petty adjuncts dropped away, though many in ancient and even modern times, Hort notes, have tried to persuade themselves that they are still binding on all Christians. In other words, the 4 legal requirements that the Jerusalem church asked the brothers to pass on to the churches that were disputing these things finally dropped away, and by the time of Paul's later work in Corinth and Rome, they were a memory. So Fenton Hort believed that the authority structure of the New Testament was not governance from Jerusalem. Now, if we'd only believed that, if Jehovah's Witnesses had only taken this book seriously, the judgments of a great Christian scholar to whom they owed their New Testament, the history of the Watchtower and Jehovah's Witnesses would have been much different.
All right. See you later.